Hello everybody, today I'm going to be talking about a couple things that are seemingly a bit more underrated compared to a lot of the things that are being mentioned right now when it comes to why you're failing, why you're getting stuck in certain stages, and things that are outside of, well, you should have just pulled more or you should have just spent on the game, things that are kind of actually in your control as opposed to these other factors. So the first thing I want to talk about is that when you take a look at the positioning or the formation or the actual composition when it comes to your team, of course the exact positioning of characters like your tank in the front or your healer maybe on the back, or making it so that some of your ranged characters, like let's say I took out Brutus here and I had Odie in the back line, it kind of makes sense that you would of course want a ranged character in the back and have your tanks in the front. However, positioning goes a little bit more deep into this, but I kind of just want to show you exactly how the movement patterns of certain characters work and why you may end up with a couple more failed runs than you expected, specifically just because of the way that your character's positioned, not because of anything relating to your character's equipment score or their gear or their levels or anything like that. So if you first take a look at this match as it begins to run out, of course, when they're in range or when allies are in range to hit enemies, they don't move whatsoever, and as you can see, that's especially evident with Coco, who immediately had a target to fight in the front. Same thing with your tank in the front, who of course is just going to get bashed on and they're going to hit the first, frontward facing character as soon as you end up getting, or as soon as you end up fighting or starting the encounter. The mages in the back right now have currently no real threat because, of course, I don't have an assassin. And even my frontline characters, until, as you saw right there, they actually ended up beating the frontline characters, they didn't have any reason to move to the back because, of course, that's how tanking works. And unless if you're an assassin or have a specific aspect of your kit that says otherwise, you're going to hit what's in front of you first and then move to things that are in the back. That's just kind of how natural movement patterns work. But if we run things back for a second, you may notice that actually the positioning that I have, especially with my Smokey here, or specifically my healer, is actually a lot more important than you would think. Now, of course, Smokey himself had enough room to heal, but there are some arguments, or there are some people that will definitely run someone like Smokey in the back just because they don't want to get hit. If they end up using someone like Odie, they'll put Odie and maybe the supportive characters in the back, and they'll put characters or have a formation like this with warriors where the more melee focused characters in the front and then have the ranged characters in the back. But as you can see from this, there is a bit of fear that if for whatever reason this Kruger here were to move a little bit further, Smokey wouldn't actually be able to apply his healing buff here. Now the radius, as you can see here, is just barely touching Entendre. And fortunately or unfortunately, I was able to clear the stage without the help of the healing, or it looks like I'm going to be able to clear the stage without the help of it. But you have to keep in mind that if for whatever reason an enemy that is being targeted ends up jumping away, that could very easily cause my frontline characters to run away or move out of the healing radius of my Smokey, and that is very, very bad, of course, because you want to remain in range so that you receive the full effect of healing and any other buffs that are around the area. Another thing that you might be wondering is if there's ever a good time for you to switch up the front line with the back line and make it so that you don't have like a tank in the front, especially if you're fighting someone against assassins. And although unfortunately I don't have an assassin in this case, it should be worth noting that especially with this character right here, Seth, who is a rogue and will kind of just end up annihilating my backline, you could definitely make the argument that putting someone like Coco in the backline and having both of these melee characters in the front, while also having a kind of safe backline for specifically my Odie, who's going to be my main damage dealer here, is going to be very, very, very ideal. Now, normally, if there's a more aggressive rogue, or if there's a Sylvina who specifically just jumps back and has like the little green dagger, if you're not familiar with her little icon, you could end up fighting this character right here who will put a dagger on top of your head, jump to the backline, ignore everything, and kind of assassinate your DPS. But if you do end up, again, kind of baiting the positioning of these rogues and stuff like this, you will save yourself so much time and headache, especially when you have to deal with rogues. Now, of course, that does leave your frontline a little bit more open, especially if you don't have a more frontline centric composition. But even for Seth, as you can see here, he's kind of running around and jumping, and if it weren't for the fact that there were a couple ways for me to avoid getting hit, i.e. I have my Smokey in front of my Odie, so there really isn't any way, or there's a lot of characters in between the main damage dealers of the enemy team and my Odie, who's my main DPS. If it weren't for that, I would definitely be kind of in trouble right now, and even as you see it right now, I still ended up getting one shot. So whether that's an issue of gear or whether that's an issue of the fact that my Smokey wasn't in range to both heal the front line and the back line at the same time, or if it feels like there needed to be a little bit more aggression from my Coco in the front. All these different things are very, very much so factors that will contribute to whether or not you're actually able to clear through a lot of the stages. Now, I'm showing you this specifically through the Legend Tower, but we also could take a look at this when you take a look at the formations of your arena team. Now, to be clear, with arena, one of the things that is especially difficult is when you have a stage like this where if you aren't running 3 frontline kind of characters, or if you have very squishier kind of backline characters, you've probably seen someone bait out their Thorn or put their Thorn or their Temesia in the backline that will then bait your Vala to specifically and only hit that character, when in reality you want to be hitting the Rowan, you want to be hitting the Vala, you want to be hitting the Cisia, any of these other characters. Now, of course, to be clear, it would be really nice if I could run something like having a Lucius and a Temesia and a Thorin, and then have my backline characters not have to deal with someone like Vala at all. But unfortunately, that's not the nature of the game. And ultimately, although you could definitely argue that a lot of arena teams or a lot of arena offense teams will or can change based on what you're running, so it's not like any defense is really super foolproof. I will say that one of the most annoying characters actually that I don't think has been mentioned enough when it comes to PvP is this Damien character. Now, if you're not familiar with Damien, you better start getting familiar with him, because the way that Damien works is that if you read his kit, what he actually does is that Damien is not actually on the field, and rather he builds a toy chariot to kind of blind enemies and run around, and it's kind of annoying because, again, not only does the chariot kind of heal itself or stun enemies, Damien is not on the field. So if you have a composition, and this is just a bit of a spoiler for those of you that are having enough trouble or have had enough when it comes to fighting characters like these, it does take a composition like Igor, who is the really annoying gravestone rogue warrior hopper that keeps hopping around, which is really annoying. And in fact, if you pair a Damien and an Igor together, this combo is extremely annoying because you can't hit the Damien, and sometimes the timer can just get run out and you end up failing a stage. And all you have is literally, you have the Igor that's hopping on gravestones and can't get one shot, and then you also have the chariot that's floating around, which is, oh, it's just a headache. Why would anyone in their entire mind, it's super annoying. But one of the counters that I found to be extremely helpful, as per especially what you guys have been saying in the comment section, is that once Odie has access to, I believe it's either his EE or, yes, here it is. So it's I believe this is from hitting Mythic Plus or is exclusive equipment, one of those two things, whichever it is. You can actually just immediately, you have an execute essentially that executes certain targets when they're a bit too low health, which is very helpful, very good. Thank you so much for that comment. But before we leave the PvP section, because again, kind of the positioning of the arena will definitely help you when it comes to trying to figure out why you're failing in main stages or in other stages, whether that's Dream Realm, etc. We do have to talk about the different map formats, and you can see how certain formats are conducive to certain compositions. While a front-to-back composition like this is definitely conducive to having characters like Vala or even Temesia kind of just run through your backline, it does allow you to run things like Thorin backline or also have your own Temesia in the backline so that you can't actually target your high priority or kind of like backline carries, which is not only helpful, it annoys a lot of people, and I've lost to it plenty of times at this point. Another thing that, again, like I mentioned, you can definitely run with this is that if you decide to run something like a Damien and an Igor, it kind of baits people to run this Vala composition because they see a very open field and they think to themselves, oh, this is so easy. This is an Arena 1 map. If I'm a higher combat power than the enemy, well, they can't beat me. I can just, naturally get rid of their carries. But if it's Igor or if it's Damien or if it's characters that stall out, maybe even someone like Brutus who kind of just annoys the heck out of your composition, well, now you have an issue because all of a sudden now you are dealing with somewhat of a stall composition, or you're dealing with a composition that is not so easy to break up or one-shot. And if you don't have enough damage dealers, which honestly a lot of people don't because they're just using something like Vala and Cisia, you're going to end up losing a lot more points than you intended. Now, again, proof of why positioning is so important and why you really need to take a look at how your characters move or what enemies will target what is just evident through any of your AFK stages. And assuming that you aren't just someone that basically fails one time and then immediately gives up, which I'm sure none of you guys are. Again, I cannot stress enough that when people are asking for advice or trying to figure out why they're failing stages, I beg you to sincerely take a look at the way that your characters move, because again, the difference between putting someone like Temesia here and here, or having your Cisia here when there's an assassin, or depending on where your Vala is targeting or who your Vala is targeting, all of these pose very big influences on whether or not you're actually able to clear. And of course, I cannot express how many times I've spent here for basically 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe even hours at a time trying to clear a stage just because they have unreachable backlines, or I have to hit someone in the backline that's a rogue, but I wasn't aware that instead of hitting the rogue in the backline, it's actually better to hit and kill all the other mages, backline healers, etc. So then I can then deal with just a random rogue and bait out their rogue instead. As a final note, I do want to mention that if you do ever see an arena stage like this where, of course, there's 3 openings, and if you ever just count how many characters you have, most of the time, at best, you have something like 1 or 2 tanks, or you have 1 or 2 frontliners. What are you supposed to do with the 3rd slot? What happens to your backline? And the honest truth is that it kind of depends. Now, of course, you could always argue that running a 3 frontliner composition could work, but in terms of 3 frontliners, that kind of means that whoever your 4th or 5th character is kind of on their own and kind of just need to struggle. So in this case, for instance, even though I consider Cannaaaa a frontline character, they sometimes just run across and they kind of leave your backline open. So even in a hypothetical composition that involves 3 tanks, let's say I even run someone like Lucius, who is arguably one of the most common frontliners, I would have to then choose between one of these other maybe less ideal frontliners to kind of take aggro, or I would have to be using something like a triple composition that involves like a warrior or a not actual like a tank character, or run a support and just pray that they don't die. Now, I don't think I have to explain to you why that's kind of a problem, but if you have someone like Cannaaaa in the backline, and again, I have something like Cannaaaa over here, well, all that's going to happen is whoever they end up putting on this section is just going to run through, immediately hit my Vala or my Cannaaaa, and then all of a sudden, bing bang boom, my Cannaaaa has got probably horses charged on her head, or there's probably an assassin that's about to one-shot her. Now again, if you've ever fought any of the story stages where a big hulking boulder, monster, whatever, is in this stage, you've kind of experienced what I'm talking about, because they are very much over-leveled compared to you. They'll just run through your backline, beat up your Rowan or beat up any of your supports, beat up the Vala, and then inevitably just one-shot your mage, your carry, whoever it is in the backline. So just keep in mind that when you're running this composition, or when you're running compositions that involve 3 frontlines, you may find more value in, again, using something like the Confining spell as opposed to something like the Star Shard if you've already unlocked the Confining spell. Otherwise, consider running something like the Awakening spell, because ultimately having a little bit less healing is a lot more annoying than you think it is, especially when you can catch stray damage from AoE nukes, like someone using Cannaaaa, and like just the initial impact damage kind of doing enough damage on occasion to just one-shot your team, even before you can get rid of the Mr. Carlisle. And now finally, although a lot of this video is going to be about positioning, because ultimately it's a little bit difficult for me to say, oh, well, you're just missing this character, because some people don't have the characters, I do want to mention that with how frequent and how many gems and tickets they give out, either through the beginning promotion of the game, or just clearing out mobs that give you chests, and then the chests have tickets, it should be noted that you will get a lot of the cast in the game. You may be missing at most like maybe 60 or maybe 65% of the cast, which is actually not as much as I thought it would, especially because they gave us so many characters to start the game with. But ultimately, I do want to mention that if you are missing a character, just keep in mind that, of course, when you're upgrading resonance levels, it doesn't matter too much if you want to just level up the positions or the slots where certain characters are taking. And outside of investing in a hero's exclusive equipment or upgrading their specific skills, it doesn't matter much if you want to upgrade the slots, because if later down the road you end up getting some of the characters that you were missing, like someone like Thorin or Cannaaaa or like Vala that you were otherwise unable to get initially, that just means that you haven't wasted any resources, and of course you can now slot in your character, get as much progression as you want, and you don't have to worry about whether you invested too early into certain characters, assuming that, again, you don't invest in their skills or their exclusive equipment. And as my ultimate PSSSSS final tip, if none of these things have worked and you're really struggling, I would really consider reading through what each of these spells do, because if I were to just give you a bit of a rundown for each of the spells and what I've found myself using each for, let me run it down really quickly. Awakening spell is definitely good for when you have a multi-frontline composition and you're playing off of less healy focused kind of compositions. In the early game, that could definitely include something like a Rowan composition where Rowan's your main healer and you don't have someone like Smokey. If you are running something like the Star Shard spell, this is kind of the spell that you'll run in general, just because it reduces the attack speed of everyone on the enemy team, but also it does damage. And of course, in terms of raw value, not only does reducing attack speed decrease their damage, it also decreases their ultimate cast, and ultimately having the decrease in attack speed makes it so that you can clear through things very quickly. It does damage. It of course also increases how much damage you deal. The attack speed and lightning spell is very nice if you have a kind of run the timer down kind of composition. And of course, if you're going to be getting one shot anyways, sometimes you won't have enough time to actually cast something like Star Shard, and you also don't get access to the Star Shard spell until a little bit later into the story. So for a lot of people, if you aren't worried about healing, take the enlightening spell. The blazing spell is something that you have to purchase through the store. That's like $1 or something like that, which is kind of feels a little bit unfortunate because it does give you the stats that apply regardless if you're using the spell or not, which is the defense penetration, the physical magic defense, and increases alongside, again, the fireball and the increased damage dealt. In terms of actually using the spell though, it's debatable whether or not the attack speed will be enough because it depends on how many casts you get off, whether that's being applied to someone like Mr. Carlisle and, you know, Cecia, or if that's being applied to Vala, or if you're even able to use the attack speed thing, because if you're running a full frontline attack speed composition, then the enlightening spell doesn't really make any sense for you. But then we have two of the more interesting spells. We have Iron Wall spell, which is kind of different than the healing spell because this is more specific to if your frontliner just needs to not get one shot and you just need to make sure that they stay alive. This is especially helpful if you're running this on a character like Lucius and you're running a one tank composition. I cannot tell you how many times throughout the early game this ended up being my lifesaver, just because again you only have a singular frontline that if it gets one shot or if Lucius goes down, this isn't like Thorin where he can come back up and regain aggro at some point. If Lucius gets one shot, or if one of your other early tanks gets one shot, that's just it. That's over. Like now you're Rowan, now your DPS are gonna get attacked. Cecia is probably getting one shot until you know, Mr. Carlisle comes back up. Very scary stuff. Definitely consider this if you want to make progression early. And then finally, the confining spell, as I mentioned before and I've mentioned through previous videos, is one of the most insane spells that you have access to, just because again, it's a damage dealing crowd control, which for a lot of stages, especially later on, it's not enough to just have one frontliner take a little bit more damage and have a couple focused attacks on them. Throughout clearing a lot of AFK stages, you won't just have 2 or 3 things attacking just your frontline. There'll be things that'll come to the backline and try to one-shot you, or sometimes the backline of the enemy will be AoE, so then in that case, it doesn't even matter if they're hitting your frontline character with a single target because it's, again, it's AoE and it'll hit your backline. In cases like this, or when you're fighting someone like Laika or Muriel, I would definitely consider taking Confining Spell, because not only does it deal damage, again, it stops them from moving, it stops them from kind of doing any ridiculous movement, and it kind of just gives your Vala or gives your backline assassin a very easy and kind of straightforward way of one-shotting it, especially if you're missing just a little bit of damage after Vala decides to swoop into the background and try to one-shot it. That's going to be all the tips that I have for you though when it comes to failing or why you might be stuck in AFK Journey. Now, of course, the elephant in the room is that if you spent more money, okay, yeah, sure, you could have definitely just cleared through some of the content if you have more power. If you just wail to get more gear score or more combat power, of course, that is going to be something that can affect whether or not you clear. But I did just want to remind you guys that not everything is super bleak. If you're around the same combat power, just under the enemy's combat power, there are many ways in most cases for you to kind of sneak a win through. It'll allow you to sometimes bypass like a barrier, or if you're stuck on a barrier, being able to beat a barrier and then gaining access to a new area usually means that you get a lot more upgrades, which is why if you're having struggles or if you're having troubles when it comes to the AFK stages, or just failing in general when it comes to fights, you should definitely take into consideration the things that I said before. But anyways, guys, that's going to be it for this video. Thanks again for watching. I hope this helped. If you guys have any other kind of guides or anything you want me to cover when it comes to the game, feel free to let me know so. Thank you again for AFK Journey for sponsoring this video. I will catch you guys on the next one. Make sure to check out the rest of my videos, Discord, you know, Twitch, TikTok, Twitter, etc., all that jazz. I'll see you guys on the next one. Good night.